Hello, everyone. Thank you again for coming. I'm James. Thank you, Wendy. I'm an assistant professor here in the IO division, and it's my great pleasure to be presenting this award. To begin, a bit of context is warranted. Wendy has mentioned that the IO division was fortunate to receive a very generous donation from Mr. Wayne Johnson. And it was immediately clear to us IO faculty that we wanted to use the funds to support the grad students. We decided that one way to do so would be to create this annual award to recognize extraordinary graduate student performance. I think we all know that graduate school can be a little bit of a grind sometimes, and sometimes it can even be frustrating or discouraging. Some of the most rewarding moments, however, for both the students and faculty come when the students are able to push through, reach their goals, and ultimately move things forward for themselves, but also the field. We, the IO faculty, decided to use the opportunity that we'd been given to acknowledge such exemplary performance and to encourage all of our students to strive for such excellence in their work. We named the award the Scientist Practitioner Award to reflect the values in the IO division here at Waterloo, but also in the field at large. The practitioner part of that word is critically important because ultimately IO psychology is about solving important problems. Organizations need to know how to recruit employees, whom to hire, how to train their employees, how to motivate their employees, how to evaluate job performance. This list can go on and on. It's here that IO psychology is able to provide such great value to organizations because we are trained in the scientific methods and techniques that are necessary to answer these questions. So as practitioners, we're interested in important practical problems, and as scientists, we're skilled at collecting the evidence necessary to address those problems with confidence. I'm very pleased to announce that Lindy Liang is this year's recipient of the IO Graduate Student Scientist Practitioner Award. Lindy exemplifies the qualities of the scientist practitioner. Lindy studies important, practical questions. For example, much of her recent research has been designed to understand the causes and consequences of abusive supervision, the degree to which supervisors engage in a pattern of hostile behaviors towards their subordinates. Abusive supervision is destructive, and it's a very important problem to understand. As a scientist, Lindy has taken a systematic and methodological approach to understanding this problem. She's conducted laboratory studies to establish causality, she's collected field studies to ensure generalizability of her results, and she has collected longitudinal data to help understand the evolution of abusive supervisory relationships. The evidence of Lindy's extraordinary work seems to grow every day. First of all, I should probably be referring to her as Dr. Liang, because Lindy successfully defended her dissertation earlier this month. I was privileged to sit on Lindy's committee, and I'm here to tell you that defend is the classic undersell. She put together just an incredibly persuasive and interesting set of studies. Serving on Lindy's committee was a pleasure. It was a lot of fun. Second, although she's just beginning her career, Lindy has a tremendous publication record. This includes 6 peer-reviewed articles, several of which in the very top-tier IO and management journals. Third, Lindy's won numerous awards. I'll list 2, but there are more. She was the most recent 2016 recipient of the SciUp Student Travel Award. And in 2014, Lindy was the recipient of the R.H.R. Kendall Award for Best Student Presentation at CSciUp. And finally, I'm very glad to say that Lindy was successful on the job market this year. And she's starting a job as an assistant professor of management at York University this July. So please join me in congratulating Lindy on receiving the first IO Graduate Student Scientist Practitioner Award.
I'd like to also invite up Jay and Wayne and Jean to have a photograph. No, Lindy, you have to come back, sweetie. If you want, yeah. So I think she'll have you stand up and provide that for you.
Congratulations.
How exciting, how wonderful. And I love Lindy's smile, I always have. So following that, I have the pleasure of introducing Wayne Johnson, who's going to give us an address about the future of HR, not what you might imagine. So please join me in welcoming Wayne.
I think I'll close this because I've got some water I'm sure to spill on it.
Okay, yeah, please don't spill.
Yeah. That's a good
Okay.
idea. Late Friday afternoon reminds me of a time a few years back when I was invited to speak at a conference, and it was a particularly long conference. It started on Tuesday afternoon and was to end on Friday afternoon. And I was talking with the organizers, and they said, well, we'd really like you to speak late Friday afternoon in a closing session. And I sort of thought about it. I'd really rather not do that. People are going to be disappearing. It's going to be hard to keep their attention. They said, well, what we'll do is there's 2 sessions on Friday afternoon. There's one at 1 o'clock and one at 2 o'clock. Would you do the 1 o'clock one? I said, sure. In I go. It's concurrent sessions, so people have the choice of which room they're going to. It's about 10 to 1, and I'm busy setting up, and there's nobody in the room. 5 to 1, there's nobody in the room. About 2 minutes to 1, one person comes in and sits about halfway back of 10 rows. And I'm sort of thinking, well, what do I do? Do I just engage him in conversation, or do I go through the presentation? And I figured, well, no, I've got to go through the presentation because people might come in late. So at 1 o'clock sharp, I started my presentation as if I've got a full room, go through the entire presentation, ask them if there's any questions. There's no questions, that's all. So I walked down to thank them, and I said, I really appreciate you coming, because otherwise I would have been speaking to an empty room. And he said, oh, that's okay, I'm the next presenter. Which meant, of course, I had to stay for his. Anyway, before I start, I want to acknowledge Pat Rowe as well. I think what Pat's done in terms of building the IO program at this university is absolutely first rate, and I would challenge anybody to identify a similar level of results in terms of program development in any Canadian university. You're leaving one heck of a legacy, and I'm personally very appreciative. I want to talk about the future of HR, and I'll warn you in advance, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to make you angry. You're going to disagree with a lot of it, and that's okay. I'm basing what I say purely on opinion. I've got no scientific research, and in this group I know that's dangerous not to have. It's only my impressions based on, I guess, 45 years working in HR. But in order to look at the future, I thought it worthwhile to look back to the early 70s, because HR has changed a lot since then. A lot of it is due to the way the workplace has changed. In the 70s, you basically had people joining organizations largely from cradle to grave. They planned to join Bell Canada, and they were going to stay with Bell Canada till they turned 55, 60, whatever it was. This day and age, a career is a series of projects or a series of jobs. So things are very different. If you look at some of the technical aspects of HR, compensation back then was highly technical, highly internally focused. We had very, very, technical systems that determined the worth of a job, sometimes not looking at what the job was worth in the marketplace, but we certainly had internal equity covered. We're much more flexible now, we're much more market oriented, and I think that's absolutely the way to go. The way we recruit back then was largely newspaper and headhunter driven. Of course, we didn't have social media and all the other tools that we've got today. Benefits were rigid, one size fits all. You will accept this list of benefits. It is what you need. We know what's best for you. You will accept this defined benefit pension plan, which has turned out to be a real albatross around a lot of organizations' necks because of the liabilities that it incurs. Now you don't see any new defined benefit plans being developed. They're all defined contribution. Flexible benefits are very popular. And indeed, cash in lieu of benefits are becoming even more popular. We won't give you any benefits. Here's some extra cash. Do as you wish. Training back then, largely done by HR, largely classroom oriented. Certainly not the case today. Much more involved in gaining people experiences as opposed to classroom learning. Organization development was largely unheard of in business in the early 70s, much more popular now. Labor relations was largely contract focused, and my sense now is it's much more contract management focused, teaching managers how to manage with a contract in place. Which I think is really key. I come from most recently an organization that had 95 collective agreements. I wish we had twice that many because we had a group of plant managers who knew how to manage contracts. And I found that collective bargaining agreements gave you a certainty that was really worthwhile in the organization. So it's unusual to hear an HR person say that he likes collective agreements. I love them, more the better. Occupational health and safety back in the 70s, very low profile. Now through a combination of legislation, financial incentives, much more critical. And the nice thing that's being brought into it now is there's a whole moral issue around nobody should get hurt at work. And I don't believe that was present some 40 years ago. If you look at how HR operated back then, HR was very tactical. Right now, by definition, we've become more strategic. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more because I think it represents a real challenge for the profession. In the 70s, we were largely internally focused. We're much more externally focused now. Back in the 70s, you had to know HR and know it inside out. Now you've got to know the business. If you don't know the business, you're not going to be going too far. In the early 70s, we were people selectors. I think we're much more people developers now. And I think we relied a lot on traditional supervision back in the 70s, and now we're looking much more at pure mentorship, which is much more critical. I think we used to be focused on process, now much more results. We used to be policy enforcers. Now we're much more policy implementers. In the 1970s, I think if you did surveys of the average company, HR was probably the most disliked function in the company. For us today, luckily, IT has come along. And so we're head and shoulders above IT. Well, you know, when you can't get your email up and running. And I think the way we hired people in the 70s into HR was very different. Jane Doe is very good with people. She can't do her line job. Let's put her in HR because she's good with people. I think that's gone by the wayside. Hopefully it has. So on to the future. I thought I'd frame it in the context of what's the ideal size of an HR department? And I think a lot of you are saying, well, it depends on the size of the company. No, it doesn't. The ideal size of an HR department is 0. None. I'll let that sink in for a second. Now, I'm only exaggerating a little bit for effect. But the way I look at HR is there's 3 components to HR. One is all the administrative functions, benefits administration, comp administration, payroll, statutory reports, and so on, that typically live in HR. Fine, if you want to leave them in HR, fine. They can all be outsourced, usually much more efficiently than an HR department can do them internally. And I've never understood why payroll lives in HR anyway. Payroll is nothing more than another accounts payable function. Why don't the finance people have it? But some HR departments will persist in doing that administrative function, but it's low value add and it doesn't have to be there. My primary argument is that line managers and supervisors have to be better HR managers themselves. And they can be, because I don't think there's a lot special in terms of what we do. Now, I expect line managers to be able to motivate their employees, to do everything that's required, to get the outputs required, and keep the employees safe and satisfied. But that is largely a thing that can be taught if the person's appropriately, well, both selected and trained. I wouldn't expect a line manager to know the ins and outs of common law in terms of structuring a dismissal package, that sort of thing. That's fine. We'll have an expert on the side for that, or maybe that person is external too. But I do expect the line manager to manage and lead. And that includes things, for example, like the classic interviews. HR people jealously hang on to the notion of interviews. I'm in HR, therefore I can interview. Gee, why can't a line manager interview? Generally, they've got as much experience as the HR people. They know the job a whole lot better, by definition. And again, a trainable skill. The third level is the strategic level. And we've heard that mentioned a couple times today. And this is where HR people largely fall down. HR people tend not to be strategic enough. And let me define what I mean by strategic. Recruiting is tactical. HR planning is strategic. How much HR planning do HR departments do? Not nearly enough. Training is tactical. Performance requirements and the establishment of performance requirements are strategic. How much is HR doing? Selection is tactical. Developing the system is, but actually going through and executing it is not. Collective bargaining is tactical. Labor strategy is obviously strategic. And there's more and more examples. Until HR people can move up that curve and demonstrate that they're capable of handling these strategic elements of the job, the better off they're going to be and the more they're going to get promoted. I was talking with Leanne during the break, and she mentioned in her question that the head of HR for Royal Bank, Zabine Hergy is her name, has no HR experience, and that is correct. It is factually correct. And in fact, the last few heads of HR at the Royal Bank have had no HR experience. And I would argue that's because the HR people haven't proven themselves to the CEO of the bank in terms of, yes, I can do what's required in the job. We've heard a lot about the term business partner today. You can't be a business partner in HR unless you can speak their language. And my sense is that HR people tend to shy away from learning the business. I think every HR person should know how to read a balance sheet. Most don't. I don't want them to be CAs, don't get me wrong, but I want them to be able to look at a balance sheet and say, hey, that's underlevered. I wonder if there's an acquisition coming because we've got an underlevered bank balance sheet. It tends not to happen. On that point, in practical terms, if you just take 2 to 3 day course on financial management for a non-financial manager, you'll know enough. You'll be able to walk into the CFO's office and you won't be befuddled by what he or she is saying to you. Similarly with, you can take any of the functions. I'll give you one more example. Sales. In most organizations, the sales department works within a particular sales system. There's about 5 or 6 different systems. But organizations are pretty dedicated to one particular system. Get to know that system so that when you talk to the salespeople, you can speak their lingo, you can understand their needs a whole lot better. What does this mean for people in this room, if I'm right, particularly about the strategic element? Well, I think for the students who want to get into HR, it's a matter of broadening your perspective. You got to know more than HR. You may get into an HR job to start, but if you want to advance within HR, you have to broaden your scope. You have to be more than just the traditional HR person. For the faculty in this room, if you want to consult in business, you're absolutely golden. You guys are rock stars already, and I'll tell you why. You possess skills and experience that don't exist in 99% of our organizations. And just to present your qualifications will get a lot of CEOs going, I can see that application. I know where that research and those publications, where they fit within my organization and what they mean for my organization. Developing business isn't exactly that easy, but you should go in with a lot of confidence because you truly are rock stars. And I'll make one final point aimed at HR people. When I was counseling HR people in the various companies that I worked with, I encouraged them to take a zigzag career path. Spend some time in HR, that's fine. Go out to the line, back to HR, out to the line, back to HR. That way you're getting the line experience. There's more and more organizations adopting that as a model now, and I'd certainly encourage it. So although I exaggerated a bit in terms of saying the ideal size of an HR department is 0, the ideal size of an HR department is certainly a whole lot smaller than it is now. Thank you.
Well, Wayne warned me ahead of time that he had some provocative things to say, and I think you did just that. So I imagine we have some comments, questions, reactions. Okay, yes, I'll bring over the mic so we can record it. Thank you.
Hi, Wayne. Thanks very much. For a guy who works in consulting that works on outsourcing type of projects, I'm very familiar with what you're talking about. Okay. Certainly have seen the discussion of moving HR to a smaller organization. I think I couldn't agree more with a lot of the points that you made. In terms of at the top level, the person being from the business or HR, and has really that HR professional shown that they deserve to be there?
Largely,
I wouldn't disagree. Okay. I would challenge, and I ask, the question is how do they get the experience to move up the curve? And if we had a long time, I'd really challenge that discussion, and I would make parallels to that to gender equality, to any kind of situation where population doesn't have how do they get that experience? Because business leaders, as smart as they are stuck in their way of thinking, and they have difficulty when people don't agree with that way of thinking, and they just assume that they're right, at which they're not, in many situations. So how does that person stay as an HR professional, yet prove themselves to deserve to be at the top?
Well, I mentioned one thing, the zigzag career path, I believe is important, and it's easy for me to say that, and it takes a long time to develop, so I get there. Self-study, learning. One of the things I encouraged a lot of my HR people to do was go shadow some finance people when they're working on projects. The finance people, typically their heads would spin. An HR person wants to talk to me? But you can learn a lot through assignments such as that. Learning, taking courses, the primary ways. I don't think we'll ever reach a day where there will be any sort of push from an equity perspective to have X number of HR people in certain positions, because HR isn't a specialized enough profession. It really isn't. There's lots of people who can do HR. Not everybody can be an accountant, not everybody can be a lawyer, but lots of people can be HR people.
Other questions? Comments, reactions?
So it sounds as though you're saying that it's better to have people, instead of trying to secure their own jobs, they should try and work themselves out of a job.
That's the ideal.
Okay. So how do you get people motivated to do that? Because it seems like it's not self-serving. I agree with you 100% that that's what you have to do. If you are doing your job well as an HR person, you're trying to get everybody skilled in what you're skilled at so that they don't need you anymore.
Yeah.
And when there's nobody knocking at your door or sending you emails every day, then you can be satisfied.
You're quite right. And it does affect job security. But if you can pull something off like that, you've earned career security.
Yeah.
So,
Teaching the students that then, so if we can teach our students that they're actually helping themselves in the long run.
exactly. Now, they're not
It's-
going to be
yeah.
in a Bell Canada from 20 to 65.
Nope.
Uh,
Yeah.
But today's millennials tend not to want that anyway.
Yeah. Okay. Very radical, and I'm signing up. I'm on board.
Other questions?
You want another question?
Yes, I do, especially from you.
Well, I know, but nobody has mentioned it yet, that Wayne came out of the military. Well, I guess I mentioned it, but, and from personnel in the military.
Yep.
And I wondered if you had any comments to make on HR, not only in the military, but in government and civil service
Oh,
generally.
don't get me started. My wife is laughing. Back then, the military, and I didn't know much about other government departments at that point, the military was very overly structured. For example, they had a number of aptitude tests to determine what trade you would go into. And I'm just making numbers up now. To be a vehicle mechanic, you had to get 45 on this particular test. And if somebody got 44, that's it. There is no way that the person who scored 44 can be a vehicle tech. Of course, that's ridiculous. We all know that. I don't know where the military's at now. I suspect there's been some great minds go through there. I suspect it's a lot better now. Government generally, it's abominable. I had the sad fortune of working on a project for the government for 5 months last year. And prior to that, the late 1980s, I worked for the government. And when I left that job in the 80s, I swore I'd never do it again. I guess something wrong with my memory because I took on this project last year. And from what I saw, nothing has changed in the last 30 to 40 years within the government proper. That's only one person's observation. Highly structured, overly bureaucratic, very process focused. They couldn't tell you what the outcomes of HR are, let alone measuring them and reporting on them.
Not a place for anybody who wants to go to work and.
Some people might enjoy it. The whole, I think when you're looking for a job now, to my mind, it's not so much aptitudes and skills. From the employer's point of view, they're easy to assess. It's very much cultural fit and how you're going to enjoy working in the organization. And I don't begrudge anybody who wants to work for the government. If that's a good fit for you, terrific. You're going to enjoy it, and you're probably going to thrive. But make sure you're going into an organization whose culture matches your personal values.
Thank you. Any additional comments or questions?
Lynching can take place later if you wish.
Please join me in thanking Wayne for his provocative speech and his generous gift.